You know, if you take people, and I've told you this, and you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, you know, that they know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, by your own definitions, right, within the value structure that you've created to the degree that you've done that, what would you be like? Well, you know, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward. And they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. And so you could say, well, in part, perhaps the reason that you're suffering unbearably can be left at your feet, because you're not everything you could be, and you know it. And of course, that's a terrible thing to admit, and it's a terrible thing to consider, but there's real promise in it, right? Because it means that perhaps there's another way that you could look at the world, and another way that you could act in the world. So what it would reflect back to you would be much better than what it reflects back to you now. And then the second part of that is, well, imagine that many people did that, because we've done a lot as human beings. We've done a lot of remarkable things. And I've told you already, I think before, that today, for example, about 250,000 people will be lifted out of abject poverty, and about 300,000 people attached to the electrical power grid. We're lifting people out of poverty collectively at a faster rate that's ever occurred in the history of humankind by a huge margin. And that's been going on unbelievably quickly since the year 2000. The UN had planned to have poverty between 2000 and 2015, and it was accomplished by 2013. So there's inequality developing in many places, and you hear lots of political agitation about that. But overall, the tide is lifting everyone up, and that's a great thing. And we have no idea how fast we could multiply that if people got their act together and really aimed at it. Because, you know, my experience is with people that we're probably running at about 51% of our capacity. I mean, you can think about this yourselves. I often ask undergraduates how many hours a day you waste, or how many hours a week you waste. And the classic answer is something like 4 to 6 hours a day. You know, inefficient studying, watching things on YouTube that not only do you not want to watch, that you don't even care about, that make you feel horrible about watching after you're done. That's probably 4 hours right there. You know, you think, well, that's 25 hours a week. It's 100 hours a month. That's 2.5 full work weeks. It's half a year of work weeks per year. And if your time is worth $20 an hour, which is a radical underestimate, it's probably more like 50 if you think about it in terms of deferred wages. If you're wasting 20 hours a week, you're wasting $50,000 a year. And you are doing that right now. And it's because you're young, wasting $50,000 a year is a way bigger catastrophe than it would be for me to waste it, because I'm not going to last nearly as long. And so if your life isn't everything it could be, you could ask yourself, well, what would happen if you just stopped wasting the opportunities that are in front of you? You'd be, who knows how much more efficient? 10 times more efficient. 20 times more efficient. That's the Pareto distribution. You have no idea how efficient people get. It's off the charts. Well, and if we all got our act together collectively and stopped making things worse, because that's another thing people do all the time. Not only do they not do what they should to make things better, they actively attempt to make things worse because they're spiteful or resentful or arrogant or deceitful or homicidal or genocidal, or all of those things all bundled together in an absolutely pathological package. If people stopped really, really trying just to make things worse, we have no idea how much better they would get just because of that. So there's this weird dynamic that's part of the existential system of ideas between human vulnerability, social judgment, both of which are major causes of suffering, and the failure of individuals to adopt the responsibility that they know they should adopt. And that's the thing that's interesting too, is that, and like another thing I've often asked my undergraduate classes is, you know, there's this idea that people have a conscience. And you know what the conscience is. It's this feeling or voice you have in your head just before you do something that you know is stupid, telling you that probably you shouldn't do that stupid thing. You don't have to listen to it, strangely enough. But you go ahead and do it anyways, and then, of course, exactly what the conscience told you was going to happen inevitably happens, so that you feel even stupider about it than you would if it happened by accident. Because you know, I knew this was going to happen, I got a warning it was going to happen, and I went and did it anyways. And the funny thing, too, is that that conscience operates within people, and we really don't understand what the hell that is. So you might say, well, what would happen if you abided by your conscience for 5 years or for 10 years? What sort of position might you be in? What sort of family might you have? What sort of relationship might you be able to forge? And you can be bloody sure that a relationship that's forged on the basis of who you actually are is going to be a lot stronger and more welcome than one that's forged on the basis of who you aren't. Now, of course, that means that the person you're with has to deal with the full force of you in all your ability and your catastrophe. And that's a very, very difficult thing to negotiate. But if you do negotiate it, well, at least you have something, you have somewhere solid to stand, and you have somewhere to live. You have a real life. And it's a great basis upon which to bring children into the world, for example, because you can have an actual relationship with them instead of torturing them half to death, which is what happens in a tremendously large minority of cases. Well, it's more than that too, because, and this is what I'll close with, and this is why I wanted to introduce Solzhenitsyn's writings to you. You see, because it isn't merely that your fate depends on whether or not you get your act together and to what degree you decide that you're going to live out your own genuine being. It isn't only your fate. It's the fate of everyone that you're networked with. And so, you think, well, there's 7 billion people in the world. We're going to peak at about 9 billion, by the way, and then it'll decline rapidly. But 7 billion people in the world, and who are you? You're just one little dust mote among that 7 billion. And so it really doesn't matter what you do or don't do, but that's simply not the case. It's the wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network. Of course, that's even more true now that we have social media. You'll know 1,000 people, at least over the course of your life. And they'll know 1,000 people each, and that puts you one person away from 1 million, and 2 persons away from 1 billion. And so that's how you're connected. And the things you do, they're like dropping a stone in a pond. The ripples move outward, and they affect things in ways that you can't fully comprehend. And it means that the things that you do and that you don't do are far more important than you think. And so if you act that way, of course, the terror of realizing that is that it actually starts to matter what you do. And you might say, well, that's better than living a meaningless existence. It's better for it to matter. But I mean, if you really asked yourself, would you be so sure if you had the choice? I can live with no responsibility whatsoever. The price I pay is that nothing matters. Or I can reverse it and everything matters. But I have to take the responsibility that's associated with that. It's not so obvious to me that people would take the meaningful path. When you say, well, nihilists suffer dreadfully because there's no meaning in their life and they still suffer. Yeah, but the advantage is they have no responsibility. So that's the payoff, and I actually think that's the motivation. Say, well, I can't help being nihilistic. All my belief systems have collapsed. It's like, yeah, maybe. Maybe you've just allowed them to collapse because it's a hell of a lot easier than acting them out. And the price you pay is some meaningless suffering, but you can always whine about that and people will feel sorry for you, and you have the option of taking the pathway of the martyr, so that's a pretty good deal, all things considered, especially when the alternative is to bear your burden properly and to live forthrightly in the world. Well, what Solzhenitsyn figured out, and so many people in the 20th century, it's not just him, even though he's the best example, is that if you live a pathological life, you pathologize your society. And if enough people do that, then it's hell. Really. Really. And you can read the Gulag Archipelago if you have the fortitude to do that, and you'll see exactly what hell is like. And then you can decide if that's a place you'd like to visit, or even more importantly, if it's a place you'd like to visit and take all your family and friends. Because that's what happened in the 20th century. The first rule, which is kind of a comical rule, is stand up straight with your shoulders back. You want to present yourself to the world in a manner that doesn't disgrace you in some sense. That might be a good way to think about it. And you don't want to disgrace yourself, because the consequence of disgrace is emotional dysregulation. More pain, less positive emotion. And so the best way to present yourself is to stand up. forthrightly, and to stretch out, and to occupy some space, and you make yourself sort of vulnerable by doing that because you open up the front of your body, right? But it's a sign of confidence, and that way people are most likely to give you the benefit of the doubt. And that's a good way to start regulating your mood. But not only does it directly regulate your mood to stand up, because it's so tightly associated, like postural flexion is associated with serotonin and emotional regulation, but also because if you straighten up and you present yourself in that manner, then other people are more likely to take you seriously. And that's another way that you can at least give yourself the bloody benefit of the doubt, right? And confront the world in a courageous manner. And that's a really good way of figuring out how to establish yourself in multiple competence hierarchies, because one of the general rules of thumb about how to be successful is to confront things that frighten you forthrightly and with courage. And that's kind of a universal strategy for success. Rule number 2 is treat yourself like you're someone that you care about. You should figure out how you would like to be treated, like you were taking care of yourself, not how you would like people to respond to you. It's more important than that. It's like, imagine you had a child that you really cared for, and someone said, well, people will treat this child exactly like you want them to, but you have to figure out what that is. And so then you'd have to sit down for like a month and you'd think, okay, well, how do you want your child to be treated? You don't want everyone just to be nice to him, you want people to challenge him, and you want people to discipline him, and you want people to tell him when he's wrong. It's like, you don't just want everyone to be nice. That's pathetic. It's pathetic. There's no challenge in that. And so, well, you want to treat other people like you would like to be treated. Well, then you have to figure out, how would you like to be treated? And while you'd like people to fawn all over you and just lay everything at your feet, it's like, no, that's not something you'd wish for someone that you were taking care of. And then there's an additional problem, which is it's often the case that people will treat other people better than they treat themselves. That happens extremely frequently. So one of the things I pointed out in chapter 2 was that if you have a dog and you take him to a vet and the vet gives you the prescription medicine, you'll go buy the medicine and you will give it to the dog and you will do it properly. But if you go yourself to a doctor and you get a prescription, there's a 30% chance you won't even pick up the medication. And if you do, there's a 50% chance that you won't administer it to yourself properly. And so I really thought about that. When I first came across that statistic, it was another one of those little facts. I thought, what the hell's up with that? It's like, you'll do it for your dog, so obviously you'll do it for something you care about, and you're conscientious enough so you'll actually do it. So like, why wouldn't you do it for you? Your dog likes you. Even your dog would rather that you did, but you don't. And it's actually one of the reasons that modern medicine doesn't work nearly as well as it could, because people just don't take their medication. And it's not only because they don't take care of themselves. There's some skepticism about doctors, but you could be just as skeptical about the vet. In Rule 2, it's a bit of a meditation on why people don't like themselves very much. And I think there's 2 reasons, really. And one is that we're fragile and damageable and imperfect in multiple dimensions all the time. And that often just gets worse. Lots of things get worse as you get old, for example. So it's not necessarily that easy for a self-conscious being who's extraordinarily aware of his or her own fragility, but not just fragility, foolishness and errors. Like, you know yourself better than anyone else knows you. And, you might have a certain amount of dislike for someone you know because of something they did, but you know everything you did. Jesus, that's a drag, man. You have to carry that along behind. It's like, really, I did that, And then, so there's that. It's like you're weak and kind of useless and prone to temptation, and all those things. That just shouldn't be that way. And then you're also capable of pretty vicious acts of malevolence. And so you also know that about yourself. And so it's a real existential question for people. It's like, why the hell should you take care of something as sorry and wretched as you are? And that's really what the chapter is about. It's because the answer in the chapter is, you're, first of all, yes, you're pretty useless and terrible, but so is everyone else. And that's actually an existential problem, right? And what I mean by that, it's a problem that every human being has always had and always will. So it's not just you. It's a universal problem. And that there's an answer to that. And one of them is to what does it just say? Love the sinner, but hate the sin. It's something like that, is that despite the fact that you're not all that you could be, the proper attitude to have towards yourself is the attitude that you would have towards someone that you genuinely cared for. And that it's incumbent on you to act as if you genuinely care for yourself. Just like you would act towards someone that you actually cared about, some other person. And so it's a reversal in some sense of the golden rule, right? And it's a discussion of why that's necessary. And also, more than that, it's a discussion of why you have a moral obligation to do that. It's not just that you should because it would be better for you. You actually have a moral obligation to do that, I think, because you make the world a much better place, much worse place if you don't take care of yourself. So you should bloody well take care of yourself, because, well, that's what the chapter's about. It's partly because you have something valuable to bring into the world. That's the thing about being an individual. It's the thing that Western civilization has always recognized, that as an individual, you have a light that you have to bring into the world. And that if you don't bring it into the world is a dimmer place. And that's a bad thing, because when the world is a dim place, it can get very, very, very dark. And so it's necessary, not just so that you feel better, not just so that you're a number one lobster, none of those things. You need to take care of yourself because you're in the best position to do that. And it's necessary for you to take care of yourself. Despite the fact that we're mortal and vulnerable and self-conscious and capable, not only capable of doing terrible things, but actually do them. Despite all that, you still have that responsibility. And so I wanted to hit the question as hard as I can to try to figure out, why people are contemptuous of themselves. And there's plenty of reason, that's for sure. But the reasons do not justify the mistreatment of yourself. It's as simple as that. It's not a good strategy. And the next rule is make friends with people who want the best for you. And that's a meditation on my own childhood and adolescence to some degree. I had friends who wanted the best for me and friends who didn't. And, they were friends who some of them were aiming up and some of them were aiming down. And if you have a friend that's aiming down and you do something that's aiming up, then they're generally not that happy about it. They try to top your accomplishment with one of their own, hypothetical or real, or put down what you're doing, or offer you a cigarette if you're trying to quit and you've kind of done that successfully, or a drink if you've been drinking too much and are trying to stop being an alcoholic, or they're cynical and bitter and devoted towards no good. And sometimes that's family members too. And sometimes it's even part of you, But this chapter is an injunction to people, is like you have an ethical responsibility to take care of yourself, you have an ethical responsibility to surround yourself with people who have the courage and faith and wisdom to wish you well when you've done something good, and to stop you when you're doing something destructive. And if your friends aren't like that, then they're not your friends. And maintaining your friendships with them might not even be in their interest. Number 4 is compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. See, I'd been taught as a psychologist that most human characteristics were normally distributed, right? So most people were average and some people were extreme. That's a normal distribution. Intelligence is like that, and height. There's more people of average height than very tall or very short. And weight is like that. And lots of things are normally distributed, and psychologists tend to assume that everything is, but it isn't. Creative products are distributed in a Pareto distribution, and that's a whole different thing. And it's really important to know this. It's another fundamental fact, the knowledge of which can sort of transform the way you conceptualize, let's say, the political landscape. So here's an example of the Pareto distribution. There's a rule of thumb that if you run a company, that 20% of your employees do 80% of the work, or that 20% of your customers are responsible for 80% of your sales, or that 20% of them are responsible for 80% of the customer service calls. Same thing. But that's not exactly the rule. The rule is worse than that. The rule is, in a given domain, the square root of the number of people operating in that domain do half the productive work. So you think, well, you have 10 employees, 3 of them do half the work. It's like, yeah, okay. What if you have 100 employees? Then 10 of them do half the work. I plan on taking my own life very soon. Why shouldn't I? Well, I'm going to assume this isn't a casual question, that's being put out for the purposes of display. Well, the first thing I would say is you have to think very carefully through the consequences of that for other people. So I've had clients in my clinical practice who never recovered from the suicide of a family member. Decades later, they're still torturing themselves about it. And so that's what you leave behind. Now, the problem is you might be dreaming about that, because maybe you're feeling that life has been twisted against you and that people deserve to suffer for the misery that they've imposed upon you. But I would say, think very, very carefully before you go down that route. It's a terrible thing to leave people with. And so part of the reason that suicide has been illegal in most societies is because it absolutely devastates the people you leave behind. And you might think, well, if you're really depressed, then maybe you're really depressed. That's a possibility. You might think, well, those people would be better off without me. It's like, and if you get really depressed, you can think that way, and you can even get to the point where you can't think any other way than that. And I would say, if you're at the point where you can't think any other way than that, then you should tell someone and you should go to the hospital. Because that can happen, it can happen if you get depressed. And there are treatments for depression, and many of them work. For some people, antidepressants work like mad. Now, they don't work for everyone, and I'm not claiming that they're a panacea, but they certainly beat the hell out of suicide. Right? And even if they have some negative side effects, and sometimes they do, quite frequently they do, the negative side effects aren't fatal. It's like, well, there's the possibility that your condition is physical, that you're ill in some way, either physically or perhaps you have a psychological problem, maybe you were hurt, or there's lots of reasons that people get depressed that are very, very complex. I would say don't give up hope and do something final before you've explored all possible options. And if you haven't talked to a psychologist, you haven't talked to a psychiatrist, you haven't tried antidepressants, you haven't revealed to your family or people that care for you that this is how you're feeling, then you owe it to yourself and them to explore every possible avenue before you take such a step. And then you don't want to deprive the world of what you can bring to the world. That's the other thing, you have intrinsic value, and you can't just casually bring that to an end. You leave a hole in the fabric of being itself. So, and a wise man that I once worked with said, he was a very strange person. He was a psychologist at the maximum security prison in Edmonton, and I worked with him for a while, briefly, very briefly, at the prison itself. And he said, you can always commit suicide tomorrow. And that's it's a flippant statement in some sense, but he meant it in a very serious way. It's like, you only get to decide that once, and you can put it off. And so I would say just put it off, and then put it off some more, and then put it off some more, and see what you can do to put yourself together. You explore every possible option. And if you're so hopeless that you have a suicidal plan, which is a real sign of danger, if you really know how you would do it and you've thought it out, then I would say, tell someone for God's sake, tell them, or go to a hospital and tell them. And for sure, try antidepressants, but what the hell do you have to lose? So do everything you possibly can to address the issue before you do something like that. And do give some thought to the people that you're going to leave behind, because believe me, you may just absolutely wipe them out in a way that they will never recover from. You cannot fix someone's suicide. You're stuck with it. And you think you torture yourself for the rest of your life. If I would have only known, if I would have only said something different. This particular client talked to her relative, a sibling, who committed suicide, like 20 minutes before he committed suicide, probably after he took the pills. And she was kind of preoccupied because you don't know that the person at the other end is at the end of their tether. And she never forgave herself for not responding properly in that last phone call. That's a hell of a thing to leave someone with. So I would say, and the final thing I would say is, don't be so sure that your life is yours to take. You don't own yourself the way that you own an object. You have a moral obligation to yourself as a locus of divine value, let's say. You can't treat that casually. It's wrong. So those are the reasons. Explore everything you can explore to put yourself back on your feet. All the things. There's all sorts of treatments for depression. Don't leave the people around you with that to suffer from for the rest of their lives. Don't underestimate your value in the world. And don't underestimate the fact that suicide is wrong. And so those are 4 reasons why you shouldn't end your life soon, or at all, for that matter. So. Our daughter ended her life at 24 due to depression. If someone is determined to end their life, how can one change their mind? Oh, well, first of all, I'm very sorry about that. That's a terrible thing. Look, I had this friend, sorry. There's been a lot of depression in our family, so it's a question that cuts close to the bone. Anyways, I had this friend, a friend of my parents, and her granddaughter committed suicide, She was just beating herself up about that. What could have I done? What could have I done differently? This is the problem with suicide. It leaves everybody behind thinking, oh my God, what could have I done? I could have treated the person better. I could have listened. I could have been there. It's like, and she was just beating herself up about this, really feeling that she wasn't a useful person, that she'd failed as a grandmother. She's a really good person, And so I went for a walk with her and I said, and she's married and she likes her husband and he's a really good guy. And I said, look, you're blaming yourself for your granddaughter's suicide. It's like, are you blaming your husband? Are you sitting him down and telling him what a useless bastard he was as a grandfather because his granddaughter committed suicide and how he failed completely? She said, no, I'd never do that. So I said, well, don't do it to yourself. No. Depression is a terrible thing. And many, many, many things cause it. And we don't understand. We understand some of them, but lots of them we don't understand at all. Sometimes people get depressed because they're really sick. We know that depression can be an inflammatory disease. It might be associated with autoimmune dysfunction. There's lots of reasons that people get depressed, and depressed people can go places that are so dark you just cannot imagine it. And it isn't necessarily the case that you can always rescue someone, but drowning yourself in the aftermath of a suicide is not helpful. So there's a good room for self-forgiveness there, maybe you did some things you shouldn't have done that were reprehensible and all of that, but you don't want to beat yourself up. Remember the presumption of innocence, right? Innocent until proven guilty. And you have to apply that to yourself. I think there are times when people are so depressed that there isn't anything that anyone can do. And the depressed person thinks, and this is probably the worst part of it, the depressed person thinks, everywhere I look, it's nothing but catastrophe. And I can't see any way out of it. I can't see any path forward whatsoever. And then they think as well, and maybe it's the combination of these two thoughts that really make people suicidal. It's like, it's hopeless. It isn't going to get any better. No matter where I turn, there's no escape. The suffering is unbearable. And I'm absolutely no use whatsoever to anyone. It would be better for everyone if I was just gone, because if I'm not so much of a burden now that it's going to destroy their life, then I'm going to be that much of a burden in the future. And so it's hard to imagine what that's like for people, but it's dreadful. And there's lots of ways you get there. And so you can listen to people. You can desperately encourage them to seek the help they need. Like I've seen antidepressants work miracles on very, very many people. Now, they don't work for everyone, and they're not a panacea, but, they have side effects and all of that. But one of the side effects of untreated depression is that you kill yourself, and there is no recovery from that. And the probability is actually rather high. So you can go to war with them about antidepressants. If the person can't get out of their depression and they're suicidal, it's like, what do they have to lose? 1 month on antidepressants. They'll know. Well, they might have to experiment longer because it would depend on, some people respond better to some classes of antidepressants than the others. It's worth having a war with someone if they're in dire straits, and they won't do everything they can to get better. ECT works, electroconvulsive therapy works for intractable depression. It's a terrible thing to contemplate, but the modern versions of ECT aren't. One flew over the cuckoo's nest. And again, it's like there's no coming back from death. So, look, it isn't clear. You can't rescue everyone. People get sick and they die. And sometimes the way they die looks like it's depression. Depression is a multifaceted phenomena. You can be there for them. You can listen. You can watch. You can intervene. You can try to understand. You can hold them accountable. You can do all of those things. But everyone has their own destiny, and you're not omnipotent. And so sometimes a catastrophe occurs, like your daughter's. And then you should try to drag the least amount of misery forward that you can once you recover from your grief. It's an oratorio in Montreal. I think it's the second largest one in the world. It's set on a hill, at the top of a hill. And there's a huge staircase leading up to it from the bottom of the hill. And people often who are crippled and who are on crutches and so forth, or in wheelchairs, go there and make their way painfully up the hill. Or maybe they do that on their knees. And the idea is that they're struggling incrementally uphill, step by step, despite their burdens, to reach the city of God on the hill. And they're acting out. That's life. It's like the proper aim is the city of God on the hill. And what is that? Well, that's that place where these levels of responsibility are stacked together harmoniously, so that you're acting in your best interest and in your family's best interest and in the world's best interest. And I would say in the best interests of reality itself, right? Assuming that we have some integral role to play in reality, which is certainly at least true at the human level. That's the city of God on the hill that beckons to everyone. And you move towards that humbly. So that's one step at a time. And you do it despite your burden and your suffering. All of that. And that's all dramatized in that. And it's a perfect drama of that. My granddaughter, who's 14 months old, has just learned a new game. And the game is, she plays it with her wooden spoon. And the game is, she has the spoon, and then she looks at you, and then she gives you the spoon. And then you take it from her, and she lets it go. And then she watches you, and then you give the spoon back. And she's very happy to get the spoon back. But she's also very happy to give it to you. And then she turns to the next person, and she gives them the spoon, and then she gets it back. And then you can play with her. And the play is, well, now you've started to embody the principle of reciprocity, right? We can trade. And it's a repeating game. It's not one trade. You don't end up with the spoon, and I don't end up with the spoon. We both have the spoon some of the time across time. And there's some utility in the exchange itself. Okay, so she's playing with that and thrilled about it. And no wonder, because it's a walloping discovery. And so then you take the spoon from her, and maybe you hold it a little longer than she expects, and that makes her a little nervous, but then you give it back, and then she's relieved, and that makes her happy. Or you cover the spoon with your hand, and then she's a bit confused about where it might be, and you show it to her, and you give it back, and she's happy about that. Or she reaches out to grab it, and you pull it away a little bit, and move it back and forth, so she has to do a little more effort to get it. And as long as you don't push that, and it's a bit of a challenge to her, both physically in terms of coordination, but also psychologically in terms of delay of gratification, she also finds that gratifying. And the reason for that is that you're showing how robust and resilient the idea of reciprocity is across sequences of transformations. And so the Piagetian idea is something like, there's an implicit morality that emerges to constrain the infinite set of interpretations, and it has to do with the structure that will maintain reciprocity optimally in the largest, including the largest number of people across the largest amount of time. And so the way that I've been portraying that for the people who've been listening to my lectures is that, well, you need to take responsibility for yourself, as if you care for yourself. Okay, so first we figure out what's yourself. Well, it's not just you now, because you aren't just you now. You're the community of yous that stretch across time. So in order for you to take care of yourself properly now, you have to learn to play an iterative game with yourself that's sustainable and even potentially improvable across time. And there aren't many games that you can play like that, so that starts to radically constrain the set of possibilities. And then it's more constrained than that, because not only do you have to play a game with yourself that can repeat across time to minimize suffering, to remove the possibility of death, to allow for the possibility of productive movement and a certain amount of happiness, but you have to do that with other people around you and across time. And so there's you and the multiple yous embedded in your family and the multiplicity of your family members embedded inside a culture and the extension of that culture across time. And so for you to act properly, then all of those things have to be harmoniously balanced at the same time. And that radically reduces the set of potential interpretations. And that's the antidote to the chaos of the infinite array of potential perceptual worlds. Well, and then there are questions that emerge out of that, like, well, what's the best way to play that game? But we certainly know that reciprocity, fair play, the spirit of fair play is immensely important to that. And that's what Piaget documented. And it's what we all know. And also that there's something about truth that's absolutely integral to that as well. One of the things I talk about in 12 Rules for Life, and in my lectures, this has become a meme, strangely enough, something that's widely distributed on the web, partly because there's a comical element to it. It's to clean up your room. And everyone laughs about that because I'm taking that seriously. It's like, well, clean up your room. Everyone's mother has told them that 1,000 times, right? But I try to explain why. It's like, well, you have a bit of chaotic potential right in front of you. It's, in some sense, infinite in its potential. And the domain in which you can manipulate that might be rather restricted because of the restrictions that are part and parcel of your existence. But maybe you have your room, and you might have contempt for that, and so it's a complete bloody catastrophe. But you don't have to. You could think, well, it isn't a room, it's a place of potential. And as soon as you know that, then it's not your room anymore. It isn't a room. The room that you see is your preconception of the space that you inhabit. What's there is a fragment of infinity. That's what's there. And what you see is the low resolution consequence of your assumption and lazy habit and blindness. That's your initial room. And you think, well, no, that's not the room. See, part of what artists do, for example, when Van Gogh paints a room and you look at it glowing, he's trying to show you what's beyond your perception of the room. And I mean this technically, like the way that your visual system is set up is that whenever memory and presumption can replace direct perception, it will, because it's simpler. So you literally see what you expect to see. And if what you see is dull and drab and boring and pointless and uninspiring, then that's you. It's not what's there. And what the artist does when he or she re-represents that mundane reality is to remind you of what's behind it, the potential that's there. And so what I'm suggesting to people is that they take the potential that's right in front of them. It's like, okay, and here's the rule. You're aiming up. There's something that you could change, that you would change. That might be a very small thing. Could, well, that's within the grasp of your power. Would is within the grasp of your will. To combine those two things might be a very small shift. You might only be willing to make a very tiny step forward. It's like, fine, good enough. Make a tiny step forward. And that makes you a slight bit stronger than you were before. And then the next step can be slightly larger. And it's the path of humility. What human beings confront in their lives is akin to what God himself confronted at the beginning of time. And so it's easy for us to believe that we're deterministic creatures like clocks, and that it's the past that drives us forward in a deterministic manner into the future. But I don't believe that's the case. I actually don't think there's any evidence that that's the case, because people are so complex you actually can't predict them as if they're deterministic except in very constrained circumstances. And so it's a hypothesis, but it's not a very good one. What seems to me to be the case, and I think this is how people conceptualize themselves and how they act towards themselves and towards other people, and how our social structures, our political structures are constituted, is that human beings constantly confront a landscape of possibility. It's potential itself. And we have a belief in the idea of potential. We have an idea that there are things that could be. It's a very strange conception of reality because it's not a materialistic conception, because things that could be aren't measurable in any sense, right? But we certainly act as if they exist. And we all treat each other as if one of our fundamental ethical requirements is for you to confront that potential properly. And that would be to live up to your responsibility. It's just you have these gifts and talents and possibilities that have been granted to you. And if you fail to make use of them, your talents, let's say, then that's a sin of sorts. And that's a religious way of thinking about it, but it doesn't matter because that's how people treat each other. If you have a child, for example, or a spouse or a friend, brother, anyone you care about, and you have the intuition that they could be making more of themselves and what they have than they are, then you're deeply disappointed in that. And the reason you're disappointed in that is because there's a call to us, an existential call, to confront that potential that's everywhere, that faces us in every direction, and to transform it into the most functional and habitable order possible. And the way that is to be done properly is with truth. All right, you're going to have to put some effort into your life. And you need to be motivated to do that. And so what are the potential sources of motivation? Well, you could think about them in the big five manner. You know, if you're extroverted, you want friends. If you're agreeable, you want an intimate relationship. If you're disagreeable, you want to win competitions. If you're open, you want to engage in creative activity. If you're high in neuroticism, you want security. Okay, so those are all sources of potential motivation that you could draw on, that you could tailor to your own, your own personality. But then there are dimensions that you want to consider your life across. And so we ask people about, well, if you could have your life the way you wanted it in 3 to 5 years, if you were taking care of yourself properly, what would you want from your friendships? What would you want from your intimate relationship? How would you like to structure your family? What do you want for your career? Well, how are you going to use your time outside of your job? And how are you going to regulate your mental and physical health, and maybe also your drug and alcohol use? Because that's a good place to auger down, because alcoholism, for example, wipes out, 5 to 10% of people. So you want to keep that under control. And then so maybe you develop a vision of what you would like your life to be, and that associates the goal. Well, once the goal is established, and then you break down the goal into micro processes that you can implement, the micro processes become rewarding in proportion in relation to their causal association with the goal, and that tangles in your incentive reward system, keeps you moving forward. And the way it works is that it works better if it produces positive emotion when it can see you moving towards a valued goal. Okay, well, what's the implication of that? Better have a valued goal, because otherwise you can't get any positive motivation working out. And so the more valuable the goal, in principle, the more the micro processes associated with that goal start to take on a positive charge. And so what that means is, well, you get up in the morning and you're excited about the day. You're ready to go. And so as far as I can tell, what you do is you specify your long-term ideal. Maybe you also specify a place you want to stay the hell away from so that you're terrified to fail as well as excited about succeeding, because that's also useful. You specify your goal. You do that in some sense as a unique individual. You want to specify goals that make you say, oh, if that could happen as a consequence of my efforts, it would clearly be worthwhile. Because the question always is, why do something? Because doing nothing is easy. You just sit there and you don't do anything. That's real easy. The question is, why would you ever do anything? And the answer to that has to be because you've determined by some means that it's worthwhile. And then the next question might be, well, where should you look for worthwhile things? And one would be, well, you could consult your own temperament. And the other would be, look at what it is that people accrue that's valuable across the lifespan. So you do a structural analysis of the subcomponents of human existence, and I already did that. You need a family, you need friends. Like, you don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, time outside of work, attention to your mental and physical health, etc. You know, that's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you. I think the best thing you can do with regards to your conscientiousness is to set up some aims for yourself, goals that you actually value. Because how are you going to hit something if you don't know what it is? That isn't going to happen. And often people won't specify their goals too because they don't like to specify conditions for failure. So if you keep yourself all vague and foggy, which is real easy because that's just a matter of not doing as well, then you don't know when you fail. And people might say, well, I really don't want to know when I fail because that's painful. So I'll keep myself blind about when I fail. That's fine, except you'll fail all the time then. You just won't know it until you've failed so badly that you're done. And that can easily happen by the time you're 40. So I would recommend that you don't let that happen. So that's willful blindness, right? You could have known, but you chose not to. But once you set up that goal structure, let's say, and that's really, in many ways, that's what you should be doing at university. That's exactly what you should be doing, is trying to figure out who it is that you're trying to be, right? And you aim at that. And then you use everything you learn as a means of building that person that you want to be. And I really mean want to be. I don't mean should be, even those things are going to overlap. Okay, so once you get your goal structure set up, you think, okay, if I could have this life, it looks like that might be worth living, despite the fact that it's going to be, you know, anxiety provoking and threatening, and there's going to be some suffering and loss involved and all of that. Obviously, the goal is to have a vision for your life such that, all things considered, that justifies your effort. Okay, so then what do? Well, then you turn down to the micro routines. It's like, okay, well, this is what I'm aiming for. How does that instantiate itself day to day, week to week, month to month? And that's where something like a schedule can be unbelievably useful. Okay, so what's the rule with the schedule? It's not a bloody prison. That's the first thing that people do wrong. They say, well, I don't like to follow a schedule. Well, it's like, well, what kind of schedule are you setting up? Well, I have to do this, then I have to do this, then I have to do this. You know, and then I just go play video games, because who wants to do all these things that I have to do? It's like, wrong. Set the damn schedule up so that you have the day you want. That's the trick. It's like, okay, I've got tomorrow. If I was going to set it up so it was the best possible day I could have, practically speaking, what would it look like? Well, then you schedule that. And obviously, there's a bit of responsibility that's going to go along with that, because if you have any sense, one of the things that you're going to insist upon is that at the end of the day, you're not in worse shape than you were than at the beginning of the day, right? You know, you have to negotiate with yourself and not tyrannize yourself. Like you're negotiating with someone that you care for, that you would like to be productive and have a good life. And that's how you make the schedule. It's like, and then you look at the day and you think, well, if I had that day, that'd be good. And if you hit it even with 50% accuracy, another rule is, well, aim for 51% the next week, or 50.5% for God's sake, or because you're going to hit that position where things start to loop back positively and spiral you upward. So that's one way that you can work on your conscientiousness, is plan a life you'd like to have. And you do that partly by referring to social norms. That's more or less rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. But the other way you do that is by having a little conversation with yourself about, as if you don't really know who you are, because you know what you're like. You won't do what you're told. You won't do what you tell yourself to do. But, you know, my point is that you have to understand that you're not your own servant, so to speak. You're someone that you have to negotiate with. And you're someone that you want to present the opportunity of having a good life to. And that's hard for people because they don't like themselves very much. So, you know, they're always like cracking the whip and then procrastinating. One of the things you should be asking yourself is, when you spend an hour, was that, well, what if I paid someone $50 to have had that hour? And if the answer is no, it's like, well, maybe you should do something else with your time. And it depends on whether or not you think that your time's worthwhile. But the funny thing about not assuming that is, if you assume your time isn't worthwhile, what happens is you don't just sit around sort of randomly in a state of responsibilityless bliss. What you do is you suffer existentially. I read this piece of work by Jung a long while back, and it was a meditation on the injunction to treat your neighbor as you would like to be treated. And what Jung pointed out, which I really liked, was that that wasn't an injunction to be nice to other people. It was an invitation to reciprocity. It was something like this. It's like, you should figure out how you would like to be treated, like you were taking care of yourself. It's like, imagine you had a child that you really cared for, and someone said, well, people will treat this child exactly like you want them to, but you have to figure out what that is. How do you want your child to be treated? You don't want everyone just to be nice to him, you want people to challenge him, and you want people to discipline him, and you want people to tell him when he's wrong. It's like, you don't just want everyone to be nice. That's pathetic. It's pathetic. There's no challenge in that. You want to treat other people like you would like to be treated, well, then you have to figure out, how would you like to be treated? And while you'd like people to fawn all over you and just lay everything at your feet, it's like, no, that's not something you'd wish for someone that you were taking care of. Then there's an additional problem, which is, it's often the case that people will treat other people better than they treat themselves. It's a bit of a meditation on why people don't like themselves very much. I think there's two reasons, really, and one is that we're fragile and damageable and imperfect in multiple dimensions all the time. And that often just gets worse. Lots of things get worse as you get old, for example. So it's not necessarily that easy for a self-conscious being who's extraordinarily aware of his or her own fragility, but not just fragility, foolishness and errors. Like, you know yourself better than anyone else knows you, and you might have a certain amount of dislike for someone you know because of something they did, but you know everything you did. Jesus, that's a drag, man. You have to carry that along behind. It's like, really, I did that, You're weak and kind of useless and prone to temptation, and all those things. That just shouldn't be that way. And then you're also capable of pretty vicious acts of malevolence. And so you also know that about yourself. And so it's a real existential question for people. It's like, why the hell should you take care of something as sorry and wretched as you are? Despite the fact that you're not all that you could be, the proper attitude to have towards yourself is the attitude that you would have towards someone that you genuinely cared for. And that it's incumbent on you to act as if you genuinely care for yourself, just like you would act towards someone that you actually cared about, some other person. It's a reversal in some sense of the golden rule, right? And it's a discussion of why that's necessary. And also, more than that, it's a discussion of why you have a moral obligation to do that. It's not just that you should because it would be better for you. You actually have a moral obligation to do that, I think, because you make the world a much worse place if you don't take care of yourself. So you should bloody well take care of yourself, It's partly because you have something valuable to bring into the world. That's the thing about being an individual. It's the thing that Western civilization has always recognized, that as an individual, you have a light that you have to bring into the world. And that if you don't bring it into the world is a dimmer place. And that's a bad thing, because when the world is a dim place, it can get very, very, very dark. You need to take care of yourself because you're in the best position to do that. And it's necessary for you to take care of yourself. Despite the fact that we're mortal and vulnerable and self-conscious and capable, not only capable of doing terrible things, but actually do them. Despite all that, you still have that responsibility. I wanted to, hit the question as hard as I can to try to figure out, why people are contemptuous of themselves. And there's plenty of reason, that's for sure. But the reasons do not justify the mistreatment of yourself. Make friends with people who want the best for you. And that's a meditation on my own childhood and adolescence to some degree. I had friends who wanted the best for me and friends who didn't. And like you have an ethical responsibility to take care of yourself, you have an ethical responsibility to surround yourself with people who have the courage and faith and wisdom to wish you well when you've done something good and to stop you when you're doing something destructive. And if your friends aren't like that, then they're not your friends. Be careful about whom you share good news with. A friend is someone you can share good news with, You go to them and you say, hey, look, this good thing happened to me. And they say, look, I'm so happy that happened to you. Like, way to be. And they don't think, God damn it, why didn't that happen to me? And you didn't deserve it. Here's a bunch of reasons you're stupid and why it won't work. It's like, that's not helpful. You know what, the other thing people are doing if they're trying to drag you down, let's say, is they're trying to see if you'll put up with it. Because they have this idea that maybe life isn't worth living and things aren't good, and that if they can besmirch, let's say, to use an archaic term, something that's pristine and good, then they demonstrate to themselves that there is no true ideal and that there's no necessary reason to be responsible and to strive forward. There is inequality. What that means is there's always going to be people around that are better at something than you are. And that's a problem, because you can get jealous and you can get bitter and you can get resentful, and worse, you can get hopeless. You need an ideal because you have nothing to aim at, but an ideal is a judge, and you always fall short of the ideal. So how the hell can you have the benefits of having an ideal without having the crushing blow that goes along with having the judge that always regards you as insufficient? You need a goal, but we don't want to let your distance from the goal crush you. So you got to set up a goal, and then you got to break the goal down into parts so that you can move towards it and you have a fairly high likelihood of doing it. So that's a bit of practical, I wouldn't say advice, because it's better than advice. It's some practical knowledge about how to go about achieving an aim. Set a high aim, but differentiate it down so you know what the next step is, and then make the next step difficult enough so you have to push yourself past where you are, but also provide yourself with a reasonable probability of success. You really have to stop comparing yourself in some ways to other people. And the reason for that is that the particularities of your life are so idiosyncratic that there isn't anyone really all that much like you, because the details of your life happen to matter. And so maybe you compare yourself to some rock star or something like that, and, the person's rich and famous and glamorous and all that, but, they're alcoholic and they use too much cocaine and they've had 3 divorces, and it's like, how the hell do you make sense out of that? Is that someone that you should judge yourself harshly against or not? The answer is you don't know, because you don't know all the details of their lives. And who do you know that you can compare yourself to? That's easy. You. Yesterday. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. So here's a good goal. It's something like, aim high, but use as your control yourself. So your goal is to make today some tiny increment better than yesterday. And you can use better. You can define better yourself. This doesn't have to be some imposition of external morality. You know where you're weak and insufficient, where you could improve. Think, okay, this is what I'm like yesterday. If I did this little thing, things would be just an increment better. That's a great thing, because you get the ball rolling, and incremental improvement is unstoppable. You can actually implement it, and it starts to generate Pareto distribution-like consequences. It starts to compound. Then you have your goal, and then you think, I need to move towards that incrementally, because I'm kind of useless and can only do so much, and maybe not even that. But all I have to do is be a little bit better than my miserable self yesterday. To listen to your resentment is one of the best things you can possibly do. You have to admit that it exists first, and then you have to admit to the fantasies that it's generating, and you have to admit to what you would regard as the way out of it. So that's all very difficult, because it means learning things about yourself that you probably don't want to learn. But resentment only means one of two things. It means either like shut the hell up, grow up, quit whining, and get on with it. That's one thing it means. Or someone is playing the tyrant to you, might even be you, and you have something to say and do that you should say and do to put it to a stop. One of the general rules of thumb about how to be successful is to confront things that frighten you forthrightly and with courage. And the goal should be, how could I conceive of my life so that if I had that life, it would clearly be worth living, so I wouldn't have to be bitter, resentful, deceitful, arrogant, and vengeful. Like, that's sort of the bottom line, right? Because that's what endless failure does to you. It's not good. That's what life without purpose and a goal does to you as well, because life is very hard. So you think, okay, I need to adopt a mode of being that would justify my suffering. And you can ask yourself that question. What would make this worthwhile? I call the course Personality and Its Transformations, and I think you could think about that as a restatement of the idea of being and becoming. And that's what you are. You're, for whatever that means, you're an entity that both is and is transforming. And there's a rule that goes along with that, which is don't sacrifice who you could be for who you are. which means if you have to choose to transform in a positive direction or maintain your current position, then it's better to transform in a positive direction. Who are you? You're the thing that transforms who you are. But on top of that, you're the thing that transforms who you are. You are the thing that is, and you're the thing that becomes. And you should put the thing that becomes at a higher place than the thing that is. That means you also have to allow yourself to shake off those things about you that you might be pathologically attached to, habits and people, for that matter, ways of thinking, all of those things. You have to allow yourself to shake those off, and that's more like a burning. And you might say, well, I don't know what I should leave behind. And the answer to that is, that's a lie. You know some of the things that you should leave behind. All you have to do is ask yourself. You'll come up with a list instantly of 100 stupid things that you're doing that you know you could stop doing. Some of them maybe you don't know you could stop doing. It's like, well, fine, leave those alone for now. But there's a bunch of things you perfectly know well that you could stop doing that would improve your life. Everything that makes you anxious or everything that makes you upset is the same as every other thing that's ever made you upset. All those things that have made you upset that you've never dealt with, they're all laying down there at the bottom of your nasty little soul, waiting to pop themselves up in some random utterance, right? And so then you go in there at your peril, because if you're the person who pokes around in that, then you're going to get blasted with all of that stuff. It's going to come out like almost uncontrollably. Then you can sort it out. What's behind the game you're playing? And the answer to that is all the world that you're ignoring. Always. You're trying to do well in a class, and you get a bad grade. Why did I get this C-? What is it? The answer is, you don't know. Do you not know what you thought you knew? Are you not who you think you are? Do you not work hard enough? Are your values not organized properly? Do you misuse your time? Are you in the wrong field? Is the way you're construing your life completely inappropriate? Are you acting out what your parents wanted you to do and you're pissed off about it, so you're only running at 40% to spite them, despite the fact that they're paying $25,000 a year for your education? When you're in the world and something objects to you, something that matters objects to you, then in the entire unrealized world is in that thing that objects. It's all tangled up inside it. That's why it's the great dragon of chaos. It's everything that's outside of your conceptual structure. And what is that? It's everything that lurks outside of your walled city. Well, you get your C- and you don't do anything about it. Maybe you're a little bitter and more resentful, and your study habits get a little worse. So the next time you get like a D+, and then you collect a bunch of Fs, and then you stop going to school, and then you stop showering. Right? Then you end up jumping off the bridge. And so that's how the dragon eats you when you don't pay attention to it. And so it's no bloody wonder that people avoid, It's really no wonder that they avoid, because error messages contain within them the implicit world. Now, the upside of that is, well, they contain within them the implicit world. And the world isn't all negative. The C- can be the best gift you ever had, and that's the gold that the dragon hoards, right? That's exactly what that means. Every time you try to learn something, you're going to make a mistake, because what do you know? So you're going to make mistakes. And if the rule is every time you make a mistake, you're going to go jump off the bridge, then that's not a useful problem-solving strategy. And so when you make a mistake, you don't get to beat yourself to death with a club. You've got a problem. Something has objected to you. Then the question is, well, what does that mean? Well, maybe you're not looking at the world right. Maybe your goals are wrong. Maybe you're not acting properly. It's okay. So the question that arises when an obstacle emerges is, which part of this structure needs attention? And the first answer can't be all of it. Right? Because there's a piece that's broken somewhere. And then you might think, well, let's assume it's a little piece to begin with. That's the right mechanism. Watch the people around you like a hawk. Whenever they do something that you think is good, you tell them. Try to do something good. And creep right back into their persona. And they'll look around, see if anyone noticed. And sometimes they'll get punished for it. And then they won't do it again. So don't do that. But then, now and then you think, hey, I saw you do this. That was actually pretty good. I know you don't want to, because you really want to dominate them. And you don't want them thriving, because then they'd be competition to you, and you wouldn't be able to go complain to your mother about what a miserable partner you have, and you know how delightful that is. So you have to forego all that pleasure if you actually helped your person develop. So you got to get over all that. It's really annoying. It's dangerous, because they might outshine you. Well, good. Then you'll have someone to compare yourself to. That'd be a good deal. It's really rough with kids, because parents will stop their children from succeeding beyond them. They get jealous. And then they'll put them down. And then they have kids that do not like them. And they'll pay for it. If you aren't suffering from self-imposed misery, and you're only suffering from inescapable misery, maybe you could handle that. And, you could survive. You could bear it. And even maybe without becoming irredeemably corrupt. And so the goal would be, well, yeah, life is a rat's nest of miseries, and maybe it has no ultimate meaning. We could say that if we're feeling particularly pessimistic, but it still leaves one question open, which is, if you didn't do everything you could to make it worse, how good could you make it be? And the least answer is, well, it could be tragedy, but maybe not hell. That's the most pessimistic proper statement. The worst case outcome in the worst of all possible worlds is that your life could be tragic, but not hell. You're at your mother's deathbed and all you and all your idiot siblings are arguing. Well, that's the difference between tragedy and hell. You walk away from a situation like that, sick of yourself and sick of everything else too. And it's often the case that tragic circumstances bring out the dragons because the stress is high and all those things that people haven't dealt with. They don't have the energy to repress. And all the bitterness comes pouring forward. If you were all gathered around the bed of someone close who was dying, could you manage it? And if the answer is no, it's like, well, put your life together because it's going to happen. And you should be the person who's there that can do it and do it properly. And then maybe you'd find that it isn't the sort of thing that will undermine your faith in life itself. Don't want to be the thing that clings so desperately to the raft that you can't let go when someone comes to rescue you, right? You don't want to be that. So then you think, well, exactly what are you? You're not the chaos, you're not the plan. Maybe you're the thing that confronts the obstacle. And then when you know even further that the obstacle is not only an obstacle, but opportunity itself, are you so sure that this is a problem? Is that the only way that you can look at it? Or is it an opportunity? And maybe you're in the order and maybe you're in the chaos, but those can flip on you. And maybe you shouldn't be in either of those places. Maybe you should be right in the middle. That's when you go down, you see, when you're down in chaos and you don't know what the hell's going on, you have to rediscover the values that have oriented people forever. That's what you have to discover. So, for example, when I'm dealing with people who have post-traumatic stress disorder and they've usually encountered someone malevolent, they have to relearn the description of good and evil. Because if they don't, they have no framework. They're lost. They think, well, there's malevolence afoot in the world. Because the only thing that a monster won't mess with is another monster. And you might say, well, I don't want to transform myself into a monster. It's like you don't have a choice. You can either be a pathetic monster or you can be a monster with some power. Those are your options. There's no non-monster alternative, weak or strong. And I don't mean strong like dominating tyrant strength. That isn't what I mean at all. I mean strength like functioning at a funeral strength. And that's a kind of monstrosity. And when you're down in chaos, that's what you have to rediscover. You want to be safe? Forget that. That's not in the cards. You're not going to be safe. Well, then you have to be meta-safe. And that's way better because then you're not safe, but you know how to cope with danger. Well, fine. That solves the problem. And maybe it's even a better solution because if you're safe, then you just have to stay in your burrow. But if you can confront danger, then you can go wherever you want and you can have an adventure. And maybe that's what you need to do is to go out and have an adventure. So you don't even want safety because how exciting is that? Let's say we made you perfectly safe. All that you had to do was eat cakes and worry yourself with the continuation of the species. What would you do? You'd smash it all down as soon as you possibly could, just so you had something interesting and challenging to do. So you don't want safety. You want to be able to cope with danger. That's a whole different thing. You don't get to be safe ever again. Well, so what happens? You get to be stronger. Well, hey, it turns out that's a better bargain anyways.